So the big question is China the real and potentially the only big winner? Joining me to debate this is Jiang Shih-Chuan, a game theorist, better known as Professor Jiang, and Gordon Chang, author of Plan Red, China's project to destroy America. Well, welcome to both of you. Welcome back to Uncensored, Jiang Shih-Chuan. What is your view? I mean, there is a view that's mounting that China, by not being directly involved, has been the biggest beneficiary. Do you share that?
I actually don't share that view, Piers. I think that China could suffer many consequences if this war continues for too long. So China has already invested $200 billion into the Middle East. All this infrastructure investment could be destroyed. So Iran is a very important part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And the Israelis and the Americans are targeting railways built with Chinese financing. China receives 50 to 60% of its energy needs from the Middle East for the Strait of Hormuz. And so right now, China is using its strategic reserves to fuel its economy. But if this war continues for too long, then the Chinese economy may suffer.
So that's very interesting because, you know, I've been reading a lot of reports increasingly saying, no, China, they're going to benefit. And yet you come back all the time, in my head anyway, to the fact that China is, you know, pretty reliant on the Strait of Hormuz in particular being open. I mean, it's the biggest beneficiary of that strait being open. And so even though some of their oil's been getting through, it's not been all of it, has it?
Right. So remember that this weekend there were the peace talks in Islamabad. And these peace talks would not have happened without China pressuring the Iranians to seek a ceasefire as soon as possible. The Iranians are not interested in a ceasefire because they see themselves as winning this war, and they believe the Americans don't have any credibility. They've had peace talks before, and it's gone nowhere. In fact, the Israelis and Americans have used the pretext of peace talks to attack the Iranians. So I think without Chinese diplomatic efforts, these peace talks would not have occurred in Islamabad. And then you have to ask yourself, why are the Chinese so invested in peace in the Middle East? And the reason why is they have too much invested in energy from the Middle East.
Okay, Gordon Chang, you know, I have been really struggling, I'll be honest with you. I've known Donald Trump 20 years. The reasons for this war seem to have changed on an hourly basis for the last 6 weeks. He seems to be deliberately antagonizing everyone he can think of. I mean, today he's been antagonizing every Christian. He's been antagonizing, obviously, everyone in NATO, everyone in Europe. He doesn't seem to care. And yet most of the concerns from the people that he's going after are shared by all of them, which is this war was ill-conceived, has been poorly executed, has no apparent end game, and is being driven predominantly by the interests of Benjamin Netanyahu and his Israeli government. What is your view?
I think that the war certainly was necessary. And I agree with you. I don't think President Trump has made the case. So, for instance, when he talked to the American people about 10 days ago, he only used conclusory statements. And I don't think that they were that convincing. So, for instance, he said, well, you know, the Iranians will soon have a missile that'll hit the United States. Well, they very well could have that missile right now, Piers, because we know that since 2016, the U.S. Treasury has been sanctioning North Korea and Iran because North Korea has transferred all the components for a Hwasong-15. A Hwasong-15 has a range of 8,100 miles, and if fired from Iranian territory, can hit any part of the United States. We know that Iran has all the pieces. The only thing we don't know is whether Iran has been able to put those pieces together. And President Trump did not make the case on Iran's possession of highly enriched uranium, which he could have done. He just said, well, they want a nuclear weapon. But it was a much more convincing case he could have made. And I think that eventually he will make that. I think eventually the American people will understand that. And I think that they will support the war. But of course, the question is, as you point out, whether Trump will make that case to publics, American and the world.
Well, I don't see how he can successfully sell us the premise that this was always about preventing them building a nuclear weapon when the enriched uranium, which is quite a long way advanced on that path, remains massively underground, heavily protected, and the Americans and Israelis haven't got a single tiny dot of it. So as long as it remains there, and obviously getting it out of the ground would be incredibly hazardous, particularly if they deploy ground troops, I don't know how you can say that you've destroyed their chances of making a nuclear weapon. He said all that after the 12-day war last summer. And then within 9 months, we were back again on the same pretext. None of this makes sense to me.
Well, if you're talking about President Trump's statements, I certainly agree with you. But there's certain things that we need to point out. And one of them is that we don't know where that 460 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium is.
Right.
And if it's not buried underground, and if the Iranians have access to it, then, they could very well turn that into, 90% enriched uranium. And by the way, we know that it's 60% only because they told us. So it could very well be 90%. So yes, there is a imminent threat or a near imminent threat. And I think President Trump did not make that case. But if you look at the facts, I do believe that they bear out the clear and present danger assessment that the American government has in fact made.
And in terms of China itself, you got into a little bit of a spat with Donald Trump on air, actually, at Fox the other day. Let's take a look.
I have a very good relationship with China, and we work together very well. They're paying us substantial money, as you know. We've never got money before. I listened to this Gordon Chang. He has no idea what he's talking about. We have been very tough on China, tough but fair. And, it's an amazing place. But I have a very good relationship with China, and they've been doing I put tremendous tariffs. I put 100% tariff on all Chinese cars coming in, and that's destroying Europe.
So, Gordon, you have no idea what you're talking about. I think we can add you to the list of 1,000 people he has trashed in the last 6 weeks, so don't take it personally. But in relation to that, earlier we just heard Professor Chang saying that China has not benefited from this war. Do you agree with that? And do you think that Trump has been too soft on China?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think this war is in China's interest. And I agree with Professor John for a lot of reasons. We've seen the spike in oil, but more important, the spike in diesel prices in China. Now, the National Development and Reform Commission has been trying to moderate those. Yes, China does have the world's largest strategic petroleum reserve, but at most it's 140, 150 days of import cover. The real problem for China, though, is that China is now extraordinarily trade dependent. But in a deglobalizing world, and it's deglobalizing because of conflict around the world, some of which China is responsible for, by the way, we're seeing countries pull back. And that's not good for a trade-dependent country. So in a deglobalizing world, China could very well be the biggest victim of the trends.
Professor Zhang, Donald Trump's deadline for imposing a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is sort of upon us. No one's quite sure how he's going to implement this. What do you think about this idea of a kind of revenge blockade driven by the United States?
Right. So there's a lot of concern that a naval blockade is not feasible, because if you try to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, then you're within range of Iranian drones as well as ballistic missiles. But if you step back and you think about the larger strategy at work here, and I think that Gordon is right in that China is very much an export-dependent economy, and it's very reliant on free access to maritime choke points, such as the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca. So if Iran can impose tolls in the Strait of Hormuz, there's absolutely no reason why the American military cannot impose tariffs and tolls on the Strait of Malacca. And so that would raise tremendous costs for China. And so maybe the overall strategy is not really directed at Iran, but really at strangling the Chinese economy. And you can do that by actually restraining China's access in certain key maritime choke points.
But, China could, of course, as it did in the tariff war, it could hit back very strongly if it chose to. I mean, I've stood in Shanghai port, which I think is the biggest port in the world, and watched everything going out of there to the West predominantly. If China was to flex its muscles in restricting access of its goods to the world, it might suffer, of course, itself short-term economic harm, but it would cause a lot of damage to the global economy elsewhere. So it's not like they're powerless, right?
Well, as Gordon pointed out, China is an export-dependent economy. So China benefits more from trading with the world than the world benefits from trading with China. So it makes no sense for China to impose an embargo on the world. It can't really do that. The major question is, does China have a blue water navy to challenge American hegemony over the seas? And the answer is it doesn't. And the problem is that if China were to start challenging America in the seas, especially the Strait of Malacca, then that would activate the Japanese military. And Japan has actually the best blue water navy in East Asia.
Okay, Gordon Chang, roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports go to China. That oil revenue supplies around a quarter of Iran's budget, a huge portion of which is then spent on its military. Without China, the regime wouldn't be able to pay its security forces, couldn't subsidize basic goods, and would soon face internal collapse. That is the theory that is, I think, guiding some of President Trump's decision-making over a potential blockade and so on, because Iran has become, in itself, utterly dependent on China. Do you understand the rationale for the blockade based on that?
Yes. And by the way, on Saturday, 2 Arleigh Burkes, American destroyers, transited the Strait of Hormuz twice, and they did so without arrangement with Iran. So I think that if you parked a couple Arleigh Burkes in just outside the strait, you could close it. And that's what President Trump has talked about. He said that, look, we're going to seize any ship that has paid Iran's tolls. This cuts off all of its oil revenue. So really what we have is a strategy to starve the regime. Whether it will bring down the regime, I don't know. This regime is extremely resilient. But after a while, when you have no money at all coming in, then really you don't have a war effort on the part of the Iranians. So I think that eventually this will work. And the question is, how long can President Trump keep this up? I think that he can keep it up a lot longer than most people believe. So there is the makings of a strategy. And I think that it probably will work.
Professor Zhang, I mean, there's a lot of chatter about what China's view of all this has been, and you've articulated it very well, I think, why it's actually more of a concern than a benefit. It's obviously the war has exposed the fragility of the global economy when it comes to who controls the Strait of Hormuz. That is obvious, and Iran now knows that. And of course, other actors around the world now know that if you control a waterway through which a lot of the world's goods or energy flow, then you can cause paralysis around the world. So that won't have gone unnoticed, I'm sure, to people like Vladimir Putin. But you have also, conversely, had a revelation here that you can paralyze to a degree China in terms of its energy flow coming out of places like Iran. And that may be what Donald Trump has belatedly picked up on. Some people think that this was always his intention. I don't think it was, but I think he's now realized actually this kind of use of the waterways as an economic battering ram can work both ways, hence the blockade.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Donald Trump is first and foremost concerned with using American military power to benefit America first. And right now, America has about $39 trillion in debt. And we've seen these past few years that many nations in Europe and East Asia are shifting away from U.S. treasuries and purchasing more gold. If this trend continues, then America could face a sovereign debt crisis. And so the way to elevate this crisis is by forcing Europe and East Asia to depend more on North American resources, right? So LNG from America. And you can do that by sabotaging the economies of the GCC, by imposing a naval blockade in the Middle East. And so maybe there's a grand plan here.
Professor Zhang, is there a concern, do you think? I don't know who the concern would predominantly be with, but Donald Trump has been behaving very erratically on the global stage and been deliberately attacking a lot of his allies, from the UK to France to Spain to Germany and others, NATO. Is there a concern that starts looking like the real adult in the room and that the United States loses that role in perception globally?
The Chinese are first and foremost pragmatic, and the Chinese believe in mutual trade. And so I can see a situation in which the Europeans, the Russians, the Iranians see China as possibly a diplomatic savior in the situation. Certainly the Chinese were instrumental in organizing these weekend talks in Islamabad. So these talks were not effective and there were no results, but we can assume that these talks will become a regular thing even as this war progresses.
Gordon Chang, what do you think? I mean, you know, he's been pretty quiet, not saying too much, letting this all play out. Donald Trump's been the complete opposite, rampaging around, looking increasingly like someone who's not quite sure how to get out of this mess. But if he blames enough people, eventually somebody might accept the blame. You know, it's winning the kind of diplomatic war here, if nothing else.
I think he's certainly winning the propaganda war because he does look stable. There's no question about that. And that's backed up by all sorts of anecdotal evidence and surveys. But Piers, something had to be done about NATO. And, you know, as Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, said, Trump has been great for NATO because he's gotten countries, except for Canada, to agree to that 5% GDP spending limit or floor. So really, these are things that had to be done. Now, yes, you're right. Trump should not have threatened war against Denmark over Greenland, shouldn't have been making those threats against Canada, and those are not helpful. But a lot of what Trump has been saying and doing was really important because previous presidents, previous American presidents have just kicked the can down the road and let NATO erode. They let Iran develop nuclear weapons. They let this and they let that. But Trump, I think, gets credit for doing things which are politically unpopular, but I believe are necessary for the national security of the United States, but also for the safety and security of the international system as a whole. It's not just America first. This is America actually guaranteeing or creating the conditions for enduring peace in the coming decades.
I mean, that's assuming any of this works. You know, I would say the problem with that argument is I can see why this is all in Netanyahu and Israel's interests, because they just want to do as much damage in Iran as they can possibly do. And they found a president that will help them do it and smash it all up. But in terms of the American national interest here, if ultimately this gets resolved with Iran retaining its enriched uranium, with the regime still in place, albeit with different members of it at the top, with the people not rising up in the way that the Israelis had assured the Americans would happen if you decapitated the Ayatollah and the leadership. You know, if all these things, if that's how this plays out, and the Iranians have learned that they can strangle the global economy at any moment through the Strait of Hormuz if they want to, how is that not a terrible, terrible outcome for the United States?
That's a possible outcome, but it's not the only outcome. And we got to remember that the war effort is supported not only by Israel, which is a combatant, but it's also supported by Saudi Arabia and many of the Gulf Cooperation Council states. So they do not want Iran to prevail, and they've been helping the United States, and they've been backing us. So it's not just Israel. It's, I think, the region, which has come to the conclusion that Iran is a danger that can no longer be sloughed off into the future. So, you have a scenario which is perfectly possible, but there are many other ones as well, which are much brighter.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Chang, there's no doubt that what the Iranians have done by attacking its neighboring Gulf states has massively antagonized the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others. They've gone after them in their most vulnerable areas, really, which are hitting the oil refineries and hitting tourist areas. There's been a 10% reduction in people not defecting, but leaving some of these Gulf states because they fear it's not safe anymore. If that was to continue that trend, or they stayed away irrevocably, you can see the whole business model of moving from reliance on oil, which is running out, to an economy through the Gulf states based on tourism, sport, entertainment and so on, it becomes very difficult to sustain that if you don't have the people. So the stakes are pretty high here, aren't they?
It is possible that GCC does not survive this war. As you point out, the GCC is heavily dependent on expatriates, on international financing, and on global trade. And this war has shown that the GCC is really a mirage, created under the illusion that they will be protected by the American empire. In fact, we have the petrodollar system because the GCC had an agreement with America where the GCC would sell its oil in US dollars and recycle back into the US economy in exchange for American military protection. So not only did America start this war without their consent, but when this war started, the Americans abandoned their military bases and sought shelter in hotels, and that's why they were targeted by Iranian drones. So this was a very bad deal for the GCC, and I think it's very hard for them to survive this war, and that's why I think there's so much anxiety and pressure to launch a ground invasion against Iran.
When we spoke the last time you appeared on Uncensored, you were predicting that America would have to commit ground troops. Let's take a look.
Iran is putting a lot of pressure on the GCC, and I think at the end of the day, the United States will be compelled to send ground forces. Once the United States sends in ground forces, there's no turning back. It's all in. The sunk cost fallacy kicks in. It'll be another Vietnam for the United States because Iran is a mountain fortress. And the United States right now doesn't have the manpower, the manufacturing capacity, and the political will to fight a long war of attrition on the ground in Iran.
Now, you previously predicted correctly that Trump would win the election. You predicted the war with Iran. You also said that the United States would lose that war ultimately, and that remains to be seen. But on that specific prediction about the United States eventually having to commit troops, was that predicated on having to get the enriched uranium or in trying to effect a regime change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a latter where it is impossible to effect regime change from the air. And it's not sustainable in the long term. We're already seeing American F-15s, F-35s being downed by the Iranians because, first of all, it's hard to maintain these expensive $100 million planes in a long war. And second of all, the Iranians are developing creative air defense strategies against the Americans. So eventually, if you want to continue this war, you're going to have to send in ground troops because it's too expensive to maintain an air war.
But the cost on human life from a ground invasion could be catastrophic, not just for the people who get killed, but also for the massive political fallout that would head Donald Trump's way. And of course, he has got the backdrop of the United States midterm elections in November.
If you go with the attitude that one American soldier is worth more than $100 million F-15 or F-35, you're going to lose this war.
Right. So what should the attitude be?
Well, first of all, America should not be in this war. America should have negotiated a peace treaty with Iran. America should have lifted all trade sanctions against Iran and allowed for civilian Iranian enrichment, and this would have brought global prosperity to the world. The Iranians were perfectly happy to abide by a nuclear treaty that they signed under Obama, and that treaty was going very, very well. So first of all, this war should not have started. Now that this war has started, I think it's imperative that the Americans recognize that this war is lost, it cannot be won, and refuse to commit ground troops. Because once it commits ground troops, then this war becomes a sunk cost fallacy, mission creep. It'll be like another Vietnam. So right now, it's a turning point. I implore the Americans, do not send in ground troops. Once you send in ground troops, you're stuck there for 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly true. I mean, Gordon Chang, you know, that paints a pretty rosy picture of the Iranian regime, you know, towing the line on the global stage. They've shown very little evidence they would do that. And in fact, of course, the whole point of the war from the Israeli point of view is that they've been the octopus providing the tentacles of terrorism to the Houthis, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to terrorize Israel for several decades now. And that is why Israel wanted to neutralize that threat. And that is why Netanyahu worked so hard to persuade Donald Trump to bring America into it. I mean, do you think that the picture there that Professor Zhang paints of Iran being a reliable actor, perhaps if we'd done things differently, is that a likely scenario?
Yeah, I don't share it. So, for instance, with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA that President Obama negotiated, we know that the Iranians violated it. And President Trump, when he pulled out, said he couldn't certify a compliance. And we know that the Iranians were stalling and preventing inspections, which were part of that plan. And that was a direct contravention of its obligations. So, no, I don't think Iran can be trusted. I'd like to think that they could, but at least on that one, and that's the most direct precedent that we have seen that they violated it. And by the way, they have 60% enriched uranium, which they admitted to. And so that's clearly a violation as well. You just go through the list of this, Piers, and I just don't think that Iran could be trusted. It's unfortunate, but that's the nature of the regime. It wanted a nuclear weapon, absolutely determined to get it, and it would lie and cheat and steal, which it did.
What is your prediction, Gordon Chang, for how this plays out?
Well, how it plays out is determined by one individual, President Trump. And I don't know. You know, you're absolutely right when you say he's unpredictable. Now, we know what he says. I think that he is as good as his word on these issues for various reasons. He's been consistent about Iran not getting a nuclear weapon. He started this war, which he knew was going to be unpopular. So he's obviously determined to see it through. But, you know, as I said, it's up to one individual, and we're just going to have to see. As I said, I think he's going to be as good as his word.
Finally, Professor Zhang, I couldn't let you go without mentioning an encounter you had with Mehdi Hassan, who's a regular on Uncensored, in which he said you're misleading people because you're not actually a professor. And secondly, he called you China's useful idiot. Here is your chance to respond to these two charges. What would you like to say?
First of all, he's absolutely right. I am not a professor. I am not a credentialed professor. I'm a high school teacher with a pretty popular YouTube following. And it's the internet that has called me professor. In China, it's a sign of respect to call someone a professor, regardless of his credentials. So it's entirely up to you whether or not to call me a professor. And the second point, that I'm a useful idiot, look, it is entirely possible that an algorithm is propping me up because I'm saying certain things that align with the interests of certain nation states. And I don't dispute that. My rise in the internet has been meteoric. It's surprised me. But I'm committed to education. I'm committed to free debate. I'm committed to free discussion. I am perfectly happy to engage with people on both the left and the right. And I think like the path forward is open and free debate.
Yeah, I completely agree. Gordon Chang, what is your view of Professor Zhang? Are you happy to call him a professor? And do you think he's China's useful idiot?
You know, everything that Professor Zhang just said, I can certainly agree with him. I understand that title is something that people have given him, and that's fine with me. You know, he has views. Some of them align with what the Communist Party of China believes. Some of them do not, as we just heard. He has his views, and I wouldn't characterize him with that useless idiot term. I think he just has views that both do align and don't align with in China.
Yeah, which from where I sit is actually a pretty good place to be. I have the same about my own country and my own government. I agree with them about some things. I disagree with them about others. That last time I checked is actually a pretty good place for most people to find themselves. But anyway, I'm quite happy to call you Professor Zhang. I think you are an internet sensation. It's great having you on Uncensored regularly now, and please come back soon. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys.